Edison, The Mystery of the Missing Mouse Treasure by Torben Kuhlmann. Edison. Translated by David Henry Wilson. One. The University of Mice. Ka-ching! The sound of the cash register rang through the bookstore. "Let's go!" a mouse whistled, standing on a pile of books. Countless little mouse heads peeked out of their hiding places. A small boy who was buying a comic book was so deep in conversation with the shopkeeper that neither of them was paying attention to what was happening around them. It was the perfect moment. One after another, the mice hopped out from behind the books and shelves, zipping across the room on silent feet, before disappearing into a mouse hole in the far corner of the shop. After a short climb through the walls, the mice finally reached their destination. Behind the shelves lay the University of Mice. Here, any inquisitive mouse could learn anything there was to know about the history of mice. Mice who had traveled the world, mice who had made great discoveries, and also the achievements of people. For example, the invention of the steam engine and the electric light. The lectures were given by an elderly, gray-furred mouse professor whose white whiskers formed a rather messy mustache all around his nose. After a long day of lessons, he would go back to his study and enjoy a quiet evening in his armchair. His thoughts would wander back to the good old days. When he was young, the professor had had many adventures on his great quest for knowledge. Now times were more peaceful, but unfortunately, in his view, they were also a bit more boring. 2. An unfamiliar face. Today, there was someone in the lecture room whom the professor had never seen before. A tiny pointed nose was poking out from behind the last row of chairs. The young mouse waited patiently until the lecture ended and all the mice made their way home. Then very timidly, he went up to the front desk. "Excuse me, Professor, but I need your help," he said shyly. "You see, I'm looking for a treasure." The professor listened attentively. "Many years ago, my great—" The young mouse paused and started counting on his toes the number of greats it must have been, but then he decided it didn't really matter how many there were, and so he began again. "Many years ago, one of my ancestors sailed across the Atlantic, and he took a large treasure with him." "Aha," said the professor. "Where exactly did you get this information?" "Here," squeaked the little mouse, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a piece of paper, which he gave to the professor. He was prepared for questions. "He left the letter behind. He talks about the treasure in his journey to America. This piece of paper has been in our family's possession for generations. It's the last sign of life that we have of my ancestor." The letter didn't look like an ordinary piece of paper. It was all crumpled and yellowed. It must have been very old. One edge was jagged, as if it might have been torn out of a book. The professor studied the text. Written in an old-fashioned mouse language, it did indeed tell the story of a sea voyage and a treasure. "Please, Professor, help me find the treasure," pleaded the young mouse. At first, the professor didn't know what to say. After all, he was a mouse of great learning and didn't have time for such fantasies. Nevertheless, there was something about the little mouse's story that fascinated him. "To tell you the truth," he said, "I'm not interested in missing treasures or maps with an X that marks the spot, but maybe we can find out more about your lost ancestor." The young mouse beamed. "Thank you, Professor." "What's your name?" the older mouse asked. "Pete." 3. Looking for clues. The two mice rummaged through a drawer full of files and old documents. All they knew was that Pete's ancestor had sailed to America. The documents listed every ship that had ever crossed the Atlantic, and the only clue they had was the date on Pete's piece of paper. "Look at this!" The professor called Pete over. In one of the files was a photo that showed a group of people about to set sail on a ship to America. "Look closely," said the professor. "There, among all of the suitcases." The light was bad, and with the naked eye, all they could see was a vague shadow. But they wanted to have a closer look, and so with a great effort, the two of them heaved the heavy file out of the drawer and dragged it to a lamp. The magnifying glass showed a mouse. It was Pete's ancestor. He was standing among the suitcases, posing proudly for the camera. The mouse actually looked a bit like Pete, but he had twisted his whiskers into a rather ridiculous handlebar mustache. "Your ancestor must have liked having his photo taken with humans," said the professor, who obviously found it a bit bold for a mouse to push his way into a people picture. "We've found him," squealed Pete in delight. The mystery was solved, and the treasure seemed close enough to touch. Only when and where did the ship arrive? That was the question. The professor continued his search through the files and documents. 4. At the bottom of the sea. Oh dear. The ship the two mice were searching for had an accident and sunk many years ago. It had never reached America. The professor put on a pair of small round spectacles and began to read. "It looks like all the passengers were saved," he said, but the article only reported on what happened to the humans. Not a word was mentioned about the fate of the mice who had been on board. No other trace of Pete's ancestor could be found, no matter how closely they looked through the magnifying glass. They looked through photos that were taken later of the ship's crew and all the rescued passengers, but there was no sign of the missing mouse.